The morning had started like any other Tuesday in late September, with standing in her small Nashville kitchen, watching the autumn sunlight filter through the lace curtains. She held her second cup of coffee, black, no sugar, a habit she'd maintained for the past 5 years, ever since David's funeral. The house was quiet except for the soft padding of Bailey's paws on the hardwood floor. Her beloved German shepherd had already eaten and was waiting patiently by the back door, her tail wagging with the kind of hopeful energy that only dogs seem to possess. Smiled despite the melancholy that lingered in her chest like a permanent guest. Bailey had a way of doing that, pulling her back from the edge of her darkest thoughts with nothing more than those soulful brown eyes and a gentle nudge of her wet nose. Some days, wasn't sure who was rescuing whom anymore. At 47 years old, had learned to find peace in routine. Wake up at 6, coffee at 6:30, walk with Bailey at 7, return home by 8, work her remote graphic design job from the home office until 5, evening walks with Bailey, dinner, reading, bed by 10. The rhythms of her life had become meditative, almost sacred in their predictability. She'd learned that grief, the deep, soul-crushing kind that follows losing a spouse, could be managed through structure and purpose. And Bailey was her greatest purpose. The golden retriever mix had come into life 3 years ago, broken and from her previous life. Found abandoned near a roadside in rural Tennessee, Bailey had been taken to the Metro Nashville Animal Shelter where volunteered every Saturday. The shelter staff had warned that Bailey was difficult, prone to anxiety, showing signs of past abuse, but saw something different. She saw a kindred spirit, a being who had suffered, who had known darkness but still possessed the capacity to love. That day at the shelter, had sat on the floor outside Bailey's cage, saying nothing, just being present. And after 30 minutes of silence, Bailey had walked into his arms and rested her head on shoulder. Both of them had cried, with tears, Bailey with a low, mournful whine that seemed to express something ancient and true about loss. 3 years later, they were inseparable. Had even taken Bailey to get certified as an emotional support animal. It wasn't just a hobby or a whim. Therapist, Dr. Williams, had written the official letter recommending Bailey for emotional support certification after had described her anxiety attacks, the ones where her heart would race so violently she thought it might explode, the ones where her breathing became shallow and panicked, the ones where the walls seemed to close in, and the world became impossibly small and suffocating. Bailey grounds you, Dr. Williams had explained. When you're spiraling into panic, Bailey brings you back to your body, to the present moment. That's genuine therapeutic value. Had started training Bailey using online resources and guidance from her therapist. She'd learned to teach Bailey specific behaviors, coming to her side during panic attacks, resting her head on his chest to provide deep pressure therapy, fetching some emergency medication from the bathroom when she signaled distress. These weren't tricks, they were lifelines. They were the difference between a productive day and a day spent crying in bed, paralyzed by anxiety that had no logical source, no rational explanation. This particular Tuesday morning, decided to practice one of Bailey's most important tasks, retrieving her anxiety medication during moments of crisis. Had been training this behavior for 2 months now, and Bailey was finally getting reliable with it. The training method was simple, gentle, and completely nonviolent. Would give a specific hand signal, raising her hand upward with her palm facing inward, a gesture that looked almost like a wave. Bailey would respond by jumping up, placing her front paws on his chest. Then would say, "Fetch," and Bailey would run to the bathroom, find the medication bottle had placed on the sink, and bring it back to her in her mouth. It was a beautiful dance of trust and communication. Stood in the backyard near the fence that separated her property from her neighbor, meticulously maintained garden. The September sun was warm, and a gentle breeze rustled through the oak trees. Bailey stood about 10 feet away, waiting for signal. Raised her hand. Bailey immediately perked up, her tail wagging with excitement. She loved this game. She loved performing these tasks that made happy. The dog trotted toward her, jumped up right on cue, placing her front paws gently on his chest. His hand had remained raised. This was part of the training routine, and Bailey's eyes tracked it with complete focus and trust. Not fear, not anxiety, just pure, joyful anticipation of praise and treats. "Good girl," said enthusiastically, reaching into her pocket for Bailey's favorite training treats, tiny pieces of grilled chicken breast. "What a good girl you are. Yes, yes, yes." Bailey licked his face, her whole body wiggling with joy, her tail wagging so hard her entire rear end swayed from side to side. Laughed, a genuine full laugh that came from deep in her belly, the kind of laugh that had become rare since David's death. She praised Bailey profusely, fed her several treats, and gave her the hand signal to release. Bailey dropped back down to all four paws and trotted around the yard proudly, celebrating their successful training session. Didn't see watching through the fence from her driveway. She didn't see her neighbor's face shift from casual observation to something darker, something twisted with interpretation. She didn't see his phone emerge from her pocket, or the way her neighbor's eyes narrowed as she watched raise her hand again and again, each time rewarding Bailey with enthusiastic praise and treats. What did see about 2 hours later was 2 police officers standing on her front porch with grave expressions and official documents in their hands. Her heart had stopped. They'd mentioned animal cruelty complaints. They'd handed her a citation. They'd asked her to come down to the police station with documentation about Bailey's health, her vet records, any evidence she had of Bailey not being abused. As stood there holding the official citation, her hands shaking so violently she could barely read the words, she finally understood what had happened. Her neighbor had misinterpreted her training session, or worse, intentionally twisted it into something sinister. Animal cruelty charges. The words seemed impossible, like something that couldn't possibly apply to her, to this life she and Bailey had built together. Looked at Bailey, who was now sitting beside her, sensing her owner's distress and pressing her head against his leg in comfort. Bailey's eyes were warm, trusting, completely free of any fear or trauma. But none of that mattered anymore. The accusation had been made. The wheels of justice had begun to turn. And in a world of social media and instant outrage, an accusation was practically a conviction. Held the citation and whispered to Bailey, "I promise you, girl, we're going to fight this." But beneath her determination lay a deep, gnawing terror. Would anyone believe them? The notification chimed on his phone at 11:47 p.m. that Tuesday night. She was sitting alone in her dark living room, Bailey's head resting on her lap, both of them frozen in a state of shock and disbelief. The notification was from a local news outlet. Animal abuse investigation in South Nashville, dog's fate unknown. Stomach lurched. They'd already gone to the media. Hadn't just called the police, she'd called the news stations. By morning, understood the full magnitude of what was happening. She woke to find her phone overflowing with messages. Her email inbox had exploded. Her Facebook page, which she'd maintained quietly for years, posting mostly photos of Bailey and occasional updates about her graphic design work, had been found by the internet's righteous mob. The headline had been simple and devastating. Local woman accused of beating rescue dog. Community demands justice. Within hours, the story had metastasized across social media like a malignant tumor. Someone had found her address. Someone had found her workplace. Someone had discovered that she worked for a small marketing firm and had leaked that information to a Facebook group called Nashville Animal Warriors, a group with 47,000 members. The comments section beneath the original post had erupted into a hellfire of rage and accusation. "This monster needs to be arrested. Why hasn't the dog been removed yet? I hope she rots in jail. Her name should be added to the animal abuser registry. Someone should beat her the same way she beats her dog, see how she likes it." The threats escalated in violence and creativity. Sat at her kitchen table Wednesday morning, coffee untouched, scrolling through hundreds of messages from complete strangers who were absolutely certain of her guilt. The certainty was the most terrifying part. These people didn't want evidence. They didn't want facts. They wanted a villain and had been cast perfectly into that role. By 2 p.m. Wednesday, there was a small crowd of protesters in front of her house. Watch from behind her closed curtains as approximately 15 people carried handmade signs. "Animal abuser lives here. Justice for Bailey. Stop the cruelty." They chanted slogans and took videos for TikTok and Instagram. One news van pulled up, and the protesters immediately performed for the camera, their voices growing louder, their rage more theatrical. This was entertainment for them, was the villain in their daytime drama. Her phone rang. It was her boss, David, no relation, from the marketing firm where she'd worked for 7 years. "I've been getting calls all morning," he said, his voice careful and strained. "Clients are pulling projects. There are threats on our company's social media. I need to ask you to take administrative leave while this situation resolves itself." Administrative leave, paid or unpaid, didn't have the presence of mind to ask. She just felt the ground shifting beneath her again. Her job, her income, her stability, all crumbling. "How long?" she managed to whisper. "Until it blows over. Or until you're cleared, I guess. I'm sorry, I know you and I don't believe any of this, but my hands are tied. The board is terrified of the publicity." After she hung up, sat in her kitchen and cried. Bailey, sensing her owner's distress, pressed against her legs, whimpering softly, pulled the dog into her arms and buried her face in Bailey's fur. The dog's warmth, her steadying presence, was the only thing keeping from completely unraveling. Thursday morning brought the rock through the window. Was in the shower when she heard the crash. The sound of breaking glass, the violent disruption of her sanctuary. She wrapped herself in a towel and rushed downstairs, her heart pounding. Through the shattered window of her living room, she could see a rock lying on her hardwood floor, and wrapped around it with twine was a piece of paper. With shaking hands, unwrapped it. The message was written in angry red marker: "Monster, murderer, leave town before we make you." Sank onto her couch and sobbed. This was happening. This was actually happening. She called the police, who sent officers to take a report. The officers were sympathetic but offered little hope. "Could have been thrown by anyone," one of them said. "We'll document it, but without evidence of who did it." Bailey refused to leave side. The dog followed her from room to room, occasionally licking her face, as if trying to heal her owner's invisible wounds. Made an appointment with her therapist, but when she called to confirm, she was told that Dr. Williams' office had received threatening calls from people claiming Dr. Williams was complicit in enabling animal abuse by providing mental health cover for the abuser. The office was canceling her appointment and, due to the safety concerns, would likely be terminating their relationship. Even her therapist had abandoned her. Friday brought the text message from her daughter Jessica, who lived in Atlanta with her family, had been dreading this conversation. "Mom, I saw the news. Is this real? Tell me this isn't real." Called her instead of texting. Her voice was hollow when she explained everything: the training session, the misunderstanding, the police, the media storm, the protesters, the rock through her window, the job suspension. Jessica was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice trembled. "Mom, I believe you. I know you would never hurt any animal, but this is bad. This is really bad. My boss called me today. He said some of his clients were asking if the company wanted to be associated with the daughter of an animal abuser. Mom, we need to think strategically here. What if you just surrendered Bailey to an animal rescue? If you just gave up the case, maybe this would all go away. You could move, start fresh and—" "Absolutely not," interrupted, her voice suddenly fierce. "I'm not abandoning Bailey. I'm not surrendering to this mob mentality. Bailey did nothing wrong. I did nothing wrong. We're going to fight this." But even as she said the words, wasn't sure she believed them. She was exhausted. She was terrified. She was being hunted by an internet mob that had already decided her fate. Saturday morning, as sat with Bailey in her kitchen and stared at the boarded-up window where the rock had come through, she made a decision. She needed help, professional help, legal help. She needed someone who understood how to fight an accusation in the age of social media, where public opinion mattered as much as actual evidence. She started searching for attorneys who specialized in animal cruelty cases. Most wanted $5,000 retainers. Money didn't have, especially now that she was on unpaid leave. But then she found the name, David Martinez, known in Nashville legal circles as the best animal rights defense attorney in Tennessee, the man who hadn't lost a case in 12 years. She called his office with almost no hope. She was just one case among thousands, but when his secretary heard her story, something shifted. There was a pause. Then the secretary said, "Hold on. Let me see if Mr. Martinez can speak with you." 5 minutes later, a warm, authoritative voice was on the line. "Tell me everything," David Martinez said, "from the beginning." And for the first time since this nightmare began, felt something that wasn't entirely terror. It was the smallest flicker of hope. The morning of the trial arrived with the weight of an execution. Hadn't slept more than an hour in the 7 days since she'd hired David Martinez. She'd spent most of the night staring at her ceiling, watching shadows dance across the plaster, her mind cycling through worst-case scenarios. In her imagination, she lost Bailey. She lost her home. She lost her freedom. She lost everything. David Martinez had spent the past week preparing, interviewing, examining every piece of documentation about Bailey, vet records, training logs, emails from her therapist. He'd also, as promised, begun building up, but he'd been honest about the challenges they faced. "The court of public opinion has already convicted you," he'd told her on their last strategy session. "My job is to make sure the actual court, Judge Harrison specifically, doesn't do the same. We have facts on our side, we have evidence, but juries and judges are human. They can be influenced by media narratives and public sentiment. We need to be smart, careful, and prepared for anything." Wore a navy blue dress that morning, conservative, respectable, the kind of outfit that looked like it belonged to an innocent person. She'd considered this detail obsessively. What did innocent people wear to court? Nothing too fashionable, nothing too casual, nothing that could be misinterpreted. She'd even consulted David about her appearance, feeling absurd for doing so, but understanding that in this insane landscape, everything was ammunition. The courthouse steps were chaos. Camera flashes erupted like lightning. News reporters shouted questions. Animal rights activists had organized a full protest, complete with professionally printed signs and chants. Recognized some of the faces from the group that had protested outside her house. They'd escalated now, making this a media event, a cause for the animal welfare community. "Do you deny beating your dog? How do you respond to witnesses who saw you abuse Bailey? Will you surrender the dog today?" The protesters held signs high. "Justice for Bailey, animal abusers belong in jail, stop the cruelty now." David Martinez walked beside, his hand gently at her elbow, shielding her from the worst of the commotion. "Don't respond to any of them," he instructed. "Don't even make eye contact. We let our evidence speak." The courtroom itself felt like an arena designed for public execution. The gallery was completely packed, standing room only. Reporters occupied the front rows. Animal welfare advocates filled the remaining seats. Recognized some faces from her company, people who'd worked with her, who now looked at her with expressions that ranged from pity to revulsion. Judge Robert Harrison sat elevated at his bench, a man in his early 60s with steel-gray hair and the weathered face of someone who'd spent 40 years seeing the worst of human nature. He surveyed the courtroom with visible annoyance at the packed gallery and circus-like atmosphere, but he didn't clear the room. Instead, he simply banged his gavel once and called the hearing to order. "We're here in the matter of the state versus, charged with animal cruelty under Tennessee Code Annotated Section 3914-202. Ms., you understand the charges." voice barely worked. "Yes, Your Honor." The prosecutor, Assistant District Attorney Richard Thornton, was a man in his 50s with an aggressive posture and the kind of confidence that came from a long track record of convictions. He stood and began his opening statement. "Your Honor, this is a straightforward case of animal abuse. We have witnesses who directly observed the defendant engaging in violent, aggressive behavior toward the victim animal, Bailey. We will prove beyond a reasonable doubt that deliberately and knowingly abused this innocent creature. The evidence will be compelling and undeniable." Thornton was lying, or at least being extraordinarily selective with truth, but understood that juries and judges didn't always care about the distinction. Took the stand looking like a woman on a mission. She'd clearly prepared, dressed in a sympathetic powder blue suit, her hair carefully styled, her makeup subtle but impactful. She raised her hand and swore to tell the truth. "Tell us about September 17th, Thornton prompted. His voice dripped with false concern. "I was in my driveway watering my flowers when I heard a terrible yelping sound coming from her backyard. I looked over the fence and I saw her, with her arm raised high above the dog. Then she brought her arm down hard like she was hitting the dog. The poor dog yelped and yelped. I was horrified. I knew I had to call the police immediately." David Martinez stood for cross-examination. "Ms., you didn't see the defendant's hand touch the dog at any point, correct?" "Well, no, but—" "And you didn't actually see any contact between her arm and the dog's body?" "It was implied by the motion and the dog's yelping." "A yes or no answer, please. Did you see contact?" "No, but—" "Thank you. And this dog you heard yelping, was it in pain or could it have been excited?" His jaw tightened. "It sounded pain to me." "You're not a veterinarian." "No, but any reasonable person could tell." "I'll note that you're not qualified to make medical assessments. One more question. Are you aware that dogs yelp when they're excited, when they're playing, when they anticipate treats?" "I suppose, but—" David let the answer hang in the air. Then Thornton called 3 neighbors had never directly spoken to, people who lived blocks away. Their testimonies were eerily similar, almost rehearsed. They'd each seen concerning incidents with the dog. They'd noticed the dog seeming anxious around. They'd heard distressed sounds that they interpreted as animal abuse. But none of them had actually witnessed any violence. None of them had seen an actual blow. They were interpreting normal dog sounds and behaviors through the lens of the narrative that had been established in the media, that was an abuser. The prosecutor smiled confidently. He presented no physical evidence because none existed, but he didn't seem to need it. The court of public opinion had already convicted, and Judge Harrison's expression suggested he was leaning in that direction too. During the lunch break, David pulled into a private consultation room. "The prosecution's case is built entirely on interpretation and innuendo," he said, his voice calm and steady. "They have 0 physical evidence, 0 veterinary evidence of abuse, 0 expert testimony. What they have is 3 people who heard a dog make a noise and decided that noise meant abuse. That's not justice. That's mob psychology." "Then why do I feel like I'm losing?" whispered. "Because Judge Harrison has been reading the same newspapers and watching the same news as everyone else. Public opinion is like gravity. It pulls at everyone, even judges who should know better. But we have facts. We have evidence. We have Bailey's perfect health. And most importantly, we have the truth." That afternoon, as the prosecution rested its case, felt like she was drowning. The prosecutor had painted her as a monster using nothing but insinuation and fear. The gallery had watched with hungry eyes, eager to convict. Now it was time for her to fight back. But as she looked at Judge Harrison's skeptical expression, understood how difficult the battle ahead truly was. In an age where accusations spread faster than truth, where social media had replaced evidence, where public sentiment had become more powerful than the law, Could the truth even survive? Tomorrow, David Martinez would begin the defense. Tomorrow, they would present their evidence. Tomorrow, the real fight would begin. Tonight simply tried to breathe. Legs trembled as she walked toward the witness stand. The entire courtroom seemed to hold its breath. She could feel the weight of hundreds of eyes upon her, reporters leaning forward with pens poised, animal rights activists watching with undisguised contempt, Judge Harrison observing with cautious skepticism. She placed her hand on the Bible and swore to tell the truth. David Martinez approached her gently, his posture relaxed, designed to put her at ease. "Ms., can you tell us about September 17th? Walk us through that day in detail." His voice shook as she began. "That morning I woke up at 6 like I always do. I made coffee. Bailey and I took our walk around the neighborhood. We came back around 8. I was working from home that day on a design project. Around 11 in the morning, I decided to do a training session with Bailey." "Why were you training Bailey?" David asked. His hands twisted in her lap. "Because Bailey isn't just my pet, she's my emotional support animal. She's been trained to help me through anxiety attacks. I have severe anxiety disorder, and without Bailey," his voice cracked. She paused, gathering herself. "Without Bailey, I'm not sure I'd still be here." A murmur moved through the courtroom. The prosecutor remained still, waiting. "Can you tell us about your anxiety?" David prompted gently. Took a deep breath. "My husband David died 5 years ago, cancer. He was 48 years old. We'd been married for 19 years. She stopped, unable to continue for a moment, her eyes filling with tears. "After his death, I developed severe anxiety and panic disorder. I'd have attacks where my heart would race so fast I thought I was having a heart attack. My breathing would become shallow and panicked. I'd feel like the room was closing in, like I couldn't breathe, like I was dying. I'd have episodes that lasted hours, sometimes all day." She wiped her eyes with a trembling hand. "I tried medication, I tried therapy, nothing seemed to help enough. I was barely functioning, I was considering. I was in a very dark place." "And then Bailey came into your life," David said, not as a question but as a statement. "Yes, 3 years ago I was volunteering at the Metro Nashville Animal Shelter. Bailey had been found abandoned on the side of the road. She was traumatized, anxious, fearful. The shelter staff said she'd be difficult to place because of her behavioral issues. But when I sat with her, when I just held her and was present with her," his voice strengthened slightly, "I felt something shift in me, like she understood my pain because she had her own, like we both needed to rescue each other." "You adopted her." "I did. And honestly, adopting Bailey was the best decision I've made since David died. Having her changed everything. Her presence calmed my anxiety. When I'd start to panic, Bailey would come and rest her head on my chest. It was like she grounded me, brought me back to the present moment. I stopped feeling like I was drowning." David nodded. "Tell us about the training you were doing on September 17th. His explanation was detailed and careful. She described how she'd worked with Dr. Williams, her therapist, to develop specific tasks that Bailey could perform to help during panic attacks. She explained the hand signal, the specific upward gesture with palm inward that signaled Bailey to jump up and place her paws on his chest. "This hand signal," David said, "is the gesture that Ms. interpreted as aggressive and violent, correct?" "Yes," said softly, "but it's not aggressive. It's a signal for a trained behavior. Bailey learned to respond to this specific gesture. When I raise my hand this way, she knows I want her to engage in deep pressure therapy. It helps me calm down during panic attacks." Deep pressure therapy. It's a recognized therapeutic technique where the weight and pressure of another being on your chest can help reduce anxiety and bring down heart rate. Dogs trained in this technique can literally save lives. They help veterans with PTSD. They help people with anxiety disorders. Bailey's training was completely standard, completely humane. The prosecutor stood for cross-examination, his expression aggressive. "Ms., Isn't it convenient that you had this elaborate explanation prepared for what looks like animal abuse? David Martinez immediately objected. That's argumentative, Your Honor. Rephrase, Judge Harrison instructed, but his tone suggested skepticism toward the prosecutor's line of questioning anyway. Ms., you have no formal training in dog behavior, correct? I was trained by professional therapists and online resources recommended by my therapist, said carefully. I've also read extensively about service dog training methods. But you're not a certified dog trainer. No, I'm not. But neither are most people who train their own emotional support animals. The law doesn't require formal certification for emotional support animals. It's different from service animals, which do require specialized training. The prosecutor tried several angles, attempting to create inconsistencies in her story, trying to paint her as a woman who had prepared a false narrative. But testimony remained consistent because it was true. She answered every question with careful honesty, never embellishing, never defensive. Then the prosecutor asked something that made breath catch. Isn't it true that on at least 3 occasions, neighbors reported hearing your dog making distress sounds consistent with animal abuse? Felt her heart skip. She hadn't known about those specific reports. Her eyes found David Martinez, who gave her the slightest nod, reassurance that they'd anticipated this. Dogs make many sounds, said quietly. Bailey makes excited sounds when she's about to be trained, when she knows treats are coming. She yelps in excitement. She barks in anticipation. But those sounds are not sounds of pain or fear. Anyone who knows dogs, truly knows them, can distinguish between a dog in distress and a dog in excitement. But the neighbors don't know Bailey, interrupted gently. They don't live with her. They don't understand her vocalizations or her personality. I know my dog. I know her moods, her sounds, her behaviors, and I would never ever hurt her. Her voice had grown stronger now, more certain, and in that moment something shifted in the courtroom. People stopped taking notes. People stopped looking at their phones. People actually listened. Bailey isn't just my pet, continued, her eyes now directed not at the prosecutor but at Judge Harrison. She's my lifeline. She's the reason I survived the darkest years of my life. The idea that I would hurt her, the idea that anyone who loved a dog the way I love Bailey would hurt that dog, is simply incomprehensible to me. I would rather die than hurt Bailey. I would rather go to prison than have a single hair on her body be harmed. Tears streamed down his face now, genuine and uncontrolled. And the truth is, Your Honor, if you take Bailey away from me, if you separate us, you might as well be giving me a death sentence. Because without her, I don't know if I can keep going. The courtroom was completely silent. Even the reporters had stopped rustling papers. Judge Harrison's skeptical expression had softened almost imperceptibly. The prosecutor, recognizing he was losing ground, quickly ended his cross-examination. No further questions. As stepped down from the witness stand, she saw something she hadn't expected. A woman in the gallery, someone she didn't recognize, wiping tears from her own eyes. And beside her, another person looking at with something like compassion instead of condemnation. The narrative was beginning to shift. But the trial was far from over, and understood that a compelling personal story alone wouldn't be enough to defeat the evidence the prosecution was about to present. What she needed now was proof. Hard, undeniable evidence that would corroborate her testimony and prove that what had witnessed was not animal abuse, but a trained therapeutic behavior. And that's where David Martinez's surprise evidence would come in. The courtroom had barely begun its afternoon session when David Martinez stood and announced, "Your Honor, the defense would like to present physical evidence." The prosecutor, Richard Thornton, stiffened in his chair. They hadn't seen this coming. In the pretrial discovery process, David had been careful not to reveal his full hand. Now, as Martinez set up a laptop and projection screen, Thornton's confident expression began to crack. Your Honor, David began, I'd like to present security camera footage from 3 separate locations around property. This footage covers the same approximate when Ms. allegedly witnessed abuse. He pressed play. The first video showed Bailey in his backyard on a sunny afternoon. The dog was playing with complete freedom and joy, running through the grass, chasing a tennis ball, rolling on her back, her tail wagging constantly. Every movement radiated health and happiness. The video lasted 3 minutes, showing Bailey engaged in completely normal, joyful dog behavior with no signs of fear, pain, or trauma. The gallery watched in silence. The second video showed Bailey swimming in a small kiddie pool in the backyard, her entire body visible and injury-free. She was clearly enjoying herself, splashing around, clearly comfortable and trusting. Her fur was clean and well-maintained. Her movements were fluid and easy. The third video was perhaps the most damning. It showed and Bailey together on multiple occasions, petting the dog pressing against its legs affectionately, preparing food for Bailey eating enthusiastically. In every frame, the relationship was unmistakably loving and secure. When the videos ended, David turned to face Judge Harrison directly. Your Honor, these videos show Bailey on multiple dates throughout the months preceding the alleged incident. They demonstrate a dog who is happy, healthy, well-nourished, and clearly deeply loved. There is not a single frame showing fear, abuse, or trauma. The prosecutor's jaw was now clenched so tightly it looked like it might break. Furthermore, David continued, I'd like to present Bailey's complete veterinary records. He handed copies to the judge and the prosecutor. Dr. Elizabeth examined Bailey just 3 days after the alleged abuse incident. I'd like to read portions of her examination into the record. David's voice became formal and clear. Quote, Patient Bailey presents as a healthy, well-nourished female German Shepherd mix, approximately 3 years of age. Weight is ideal at 58 pounds. Coat is clean and well-maintained. No evidence of current or past injuries, scars, or trauma. Upon physical examination, no behavioral signs of abuse-related anxiety or fear-based aggression. Examination of all skeletal structure, joints, and muscle groups reveals no abnormalities, bruising, or injury. Patient responds with affection to handling and exhibits no defensive behaviors. Assessment. Patient is in excellent health and shows no signs of physical or psychological abuse. End quote. David looked up from the record. Doctor has been a veterinarian for 23 years. She examined Bailey not 3 days after the alleged abuse. If it struck Bailey with any force whatsoever, there would have been visible bruising, swelling, or injury. Doctor found none of that. The prosecutor stood abruptly. Your Honor, I'd like to question the defense's characterization of these records. Certainly, Judge Harrison said, but his tone had shifted. There was skepticism now, but it was directed at the prosecutor, not at. David continued before Thornton could object further. But there's more, Your Honor. The defense would like to call an expert witness to speak to dog behavior and the signs of abuse in canines. Dr. Michael Torres entered the courtroom. He was a board-certified animal behaviorist with a D in canine psychology from UC Davis, 30 years of professional experience, and an impressive resume that included work with police departments, rescue organizations, and university research programs. He was the kind of expert that was impossible to dismiss. After Torres was sworn in, David questioned him carefully. Dr. Torres, in your professional experience, can you describe the behavioral indicators typically seen in dogs that have been physically abused? Torres settled into the witness stand with the calm confidence of someone who'd hundreds of times. Absolutely. Dogs that have experienced physical abuse typically exhibit several telltale signs. They may show excessive fear-based responses. They might cower or retreat when approached. They might show defensive aggression as a protective mechanism. They often have anxiety around specific stimuli. For example, if they were hit with a hand, They might react fearfully when hands are raised near them. They may have difficulty with trust and bonding. They often display stress-related behaviors like excessive panting, trembling, or avoidance behaviors. "And did you examine Bailey?" David asked. "I did. I spent 2 hours with Bailey, observing her behavior in various contexts. I watched her interaction with. I observed her response to novel stimuli. I evaluated her for stress markers, fear responses, and trauma indicators." "What were your findings?" Dr. Torres turned to address the courtroom directly. "Bailey shows 0 indicators of abuse-related trauma. She exhibits excellent bonding with her owner. She shows appropriate confidence and socialization. She responds to his presence with affection and trust. Her stress levels are low. Her behavior is consistent with a well-loved, well-trained companion animal. There is absolutely nothing in Bailey's behavioral profile that suggests she has experienced abuse of any kind." The prosecutor cross-examined Torres aggressively, but the expert remained unshakable. He'd under cross-examination countless times. He explained the science of canine psychology in terms even a skeptical judge could understand. Most importantly, he presented an objective, professional assessment that contradicted everything the prosecution had claimed. When Torres stepped down, something fundamental had shifted in the courtroom. The gallery, which had been filled with animal rights activists hungry for conviction, now looked uncertain. The reporters were scribbling frantically, realizing the narrative they'd been promoting was collapsing. David then presented detailed veterinary records from the past 3 years showing Bailey's consistent good health, appropriate immunizations, regular checkups, and excellent nutritional status. This wasn't a dog being neglected or abused. This was a dog receiving excellent care from someone who clearly loved her deeply. Finally, David addressed the court directly. "Your Honor, the prosecution's case rests entirely on the testimony of one witness who claims to have seen an aggressive hand gesture through a fence, but the physical evidence tells a different story. The video evidence shows a loved and happy dog. The veterinary evidence shows a healthy dog. The behavioral evidence shows a psychologically sound dog with no trauma. The only reasonable conclusion is that what Ms. witnessed was not abuse, but a trained therapeutic behavior, a hand signal that Bailey had learned to respond to as part of her emotional support animal training." He paused, letting the weight of the evidence settle over the courtroom. The prosecution had the opportunity to provide physical evidence of abuse. They had access to veterinary records. They could have called expert witnesses. Instead, they relied on inference, speculation, and the testimony of a single witness who observed an action completely out of context. That is not justice. That is not evidence. That is mob psychology dressed up in legal proceedings. The prosecutor stood to present rebuttal, but his voice had lost its confidence. He tried to argue that the veterinary records could be, that the videos could be misleading, that the expert witness might be biased. But his argument sounded hollow now, desperate, unconvincing. Judge Harrison's expression had shifted completely. He was no longer skeptical of. He was skeptical of the prosecution's case. As court adjourned for the day, sat next to David Martinez, and for the first time since this nightmare began, she felt something more substantial than hope. She felt the possibility of justice, real, evidence-based justice. Behind her in the gallery, several animal rights activists were packing up their signs, looking confused and uncertain. The narrative they'd embraced had been shattered by facts and evidence. But the trial wasn't over yet. There was still one crucial revelation that would finally explain why had made this accusation in the first place. And that revelation would shake the entire courtroom to its foundations. The morning of day 3 began with an electric tension in the courtroom. Word had spread overnight through legal circles, and the media that David Martinez had something major to reveal. Reporters filled every available seat. Judge Harrison took the bench looking both curious and cautious, aware that something significant was about to unfold. David Martinez stood before the court with an unusual confidence, the confidence of someone holding a winning hand. Your Honor, the defense would like to present evidence of motive. Specifically, we believe the animal cruelty charges were not brought out of genuine concern for Bailey's welfare, but rather as retaliation in a property dispute. The courtroom erupted in whispers. The prosecutor stood up, objecting immediately, but Judge Harrison silenced him with a single gesture. "I'll hear it," Harrison said. David projected a series of documents onto the screen. 3 years ago, a property survey conducted on his property revealed that approximately 6 feet of her southeastern boundary had been incorrectly fenced. The fence currently standing on that boundary, installed by approximately 15 years ago, actually encroaches onto his property by those 6 feet. This is documented in the official county survey records from 2021. He clicked to the next document, an email chain. Recently, decided to finally address this boundary issue. She hired surveyors and attorneys to reclaim her property. This email, David pointed to the screen, is from to a real estate agent, dated August 15th of this year, just 1 month before the animal cruelty allegation was made. David read aloud, "My neighbor is being difficult about the property line. I've tried to be reasonable, but she's hired attorneys now. This could significantly impact my property value. I need advice on how to handle this neighbor problem before her legal claim moves forward." He clicked to another email, this one dated August 28th, just 3 weeks before the incident. This email is even more explicit. Wrote, "I've been thinking about ways to discourage her from pursuing this legal action. If I could demonstrate that she's an unsuitable pet owner, or better yet, get her dog removed, she'll likely leave town. People like that don't want the scrutiny. Have you heard of anyone who successfully used animal welfare complaints to drive neighbors away?" The gallery had gone completely silent. Even the most vocal animal rights activists looked stunned. "Your Honor," David continued, "the real estate agent responded with general advice, but what's important here is that 3 weeks before the alleged incident, was actively searching for ways to use pet ownership against as a tactic in their property dispute." The prosecutor was on his feet. "Your Honor, this is speculation. These emails don't prove anything about the animal cruelty claim." "They prove motive," David countered calmly. "They demonstrate that had a financial incentive to have leave the neighborhood. They show that she was actively considering using animal welfare as a weapon. And then, conveniently, just 3 weeks after this email chain, she witnesses alleged abuse that nobody else saw, and that leaves no physical evidence." Judge Harrison leaned forward. "Continue, Mr. Martinez." David clicked to the next set of documents. These are title records and boundary surveys. The 6 feet of disputed property, based on current real estate values in that neighborhood, is worth approximately $47,000. For removing from the property would be worth nearly $50,000 to her in increased property value. "That's circumstantial at best," the prosecutor argued. "Perhaps," David acknowledged. "But let's look at what happened after the alleged animal cruelty incident. These are property records showing that on September 19th, 2 days after the police report was filed, began the process of filing a formal boundary dispute claim with the county. In other words, while the animal cruelty case was proceeding, she was simultaneously moving forward with her own property claim. This wasn't about protecting Bailey. This was about capitalizing on distraction and legal troubles to push forward with her own agenda." He clicked to one final email chain, an exchange between and her attorney. This email is from lawyer 2, dated October 1st, during the period when the police investigation was ongoing. The attorney wrote, "I recommend we move quickly with the boundary claim while she's dealing with the criminal case. She'll be less likely to have resources or attention for a prolonged property dispute. We can likely settle favorably." The implication was unmistakable. had weaponized the animal cruelty system, not out of compassion for Bailey, but as a calculated business tactic. David turned to address the courtroom directly. "Your Honor, members of this courtroom, what we have here is not a case of animal abuse. What we have is a case of a woman who became obsessed with recovering property she felt was rightfully hers. When direct negotiation failed, when legal action threatened her financial interests, she looked for another weapon, and she found it in a misinterpreted hand gesture and a dog's excited yelping." The prosecutor tried to speak, but David wasn't finished. "Use the animal welfare system, a system designed to protect innocent creatures, as a personal weapon against her neighbor. She weaponized public outrage. She weaponized social media. She weaponized the court system. And in doing so, she nearly destroyed life, nearly took away Bailey, and nearly perverted the course of justice itself." Judge Harrison's face had darkened with visible anger. He looked toward who was sitting in the gallery, her face draining of color as the full extent of her scheme was revealed. "Ms. Judge Harrison said coldly, would you like to take the stand and explain these emails?" Attorney, a young woman who suddenly looked very uncomfortable, whispered something urgently to her client, stood up, her legs shaking visibly. "Your Honor, those emails were taken out of context. I was just asking questions. I never actually planned to." "You'll have the opportunity to explain under oath," Judge Harrison interrupted. "Take the stand." As walked to the witness stand, her earlier confident demeanor had completely evaporated. She was now visibly terrified, her hands shaking so badly she could barely grip the rail. David questioned her methodically and mercilessly. He confronted her with each email, asking her to explain what she'd meant. Tried to backtrack, tried to claim the emails were just venting, just hypothetical thinking. But her explanations grew increasingly incoherent and unconvincing. "So when you wrote that getting's dog removed would cause her to leave town, what exactly did you mean by that?" David asked. I was frustrated about the property situation," stammered. "Frustrated enough to file false animal cruelty charges." "I didn't file false charges. I really did see." "You saw a hand gesture through a fence," David interrupted. "A gesture you didn't understand, that you misinterpreted, that you then constructed into a narrative of animal abuse to support a property dispute claim. Isn't that accurate?" His face crumpled. "The property was mine. It should have been mine. She was stealing from me." "And so you stole from her instead," David said quietly. "You stole her reputation. You stole her safety. You stole 3 weeks of her life to a media-driven witch hunt. You tried to steal her dog, her home, her livelihood, all because of 6 feet of property." Broke down completely, sobbing at the witness stand. Judge Harrison's expression had shifted from anger to something approaching contempt. When was finally released from the stand, the case had fundamentally transformed. This was no longer a question of whether abused her dog. This was now a case about whether had manufactured false charges to weaponize against her neighbor. The prosecutor, recognizing that his case had not just crumbled but had been completely inverted, stood and announced, "The prosecution rests," with a voice so quiet it was barely audible. Judge Harrison looked at David Martinez. "Does the defense have anything else to present?" "One final demonstration," David said, "with the court's permission." He approached and asked her to stand. "And Ms., could you show the court exactly what Ms. witnessed that day?" Still trembling from the emotional intensity of the trial, stood and extended her hand in the training gesture, the same gesture that had started this entire nightmare. And in that moment, as Judge Harrison watched, as the prosecutor watched, as the gallery watched, the truth became undeniable. This was not violence. This was not abuse. This was simply a woman and her dog, communicating in a language of love and trust. The afternoon light filtered through the tall windows of the courtroom as Judge Harrison prepared to deliver his closing remarks. The case had transformed entirely over the past 18 hours. What had begun as a straightforward animal cruelty prosecution had metastasized into something far more complex, a revelation of premeditated false accusations, of financial motivation, of a weaponized legal system. But before Harrison could render his verdict, something extraordinary occurred. David Martinez stood and requested permission to conduct one final demonstration. Judge Harrison hesitated for only a moment before nodding. "The court will permit it, but make it brief, Mr. Martinez. We need to render a decision." The gallery fell silent. Reporters leaned forward. The prosecutor, already vanquished, watched with the numb expression of a man who'd lost everything. Sat in the back, her attorney whispering urgently, probably advising her to prepare for perjury charges. David approached at the defense table. "Ms., would you be willing to stand and demonstrate the exact gesture that Ms. witnessed on September 17th? His breath came shallow. Every eye in the courtroom was now fixed on her. She understood what was about to happen. This moment would either vindicate her or condemn her. There was no middle ground. She stood on trembling legs. Bailey called softly, "Come here, girl." The dog, who had been resting calmly beside the defense table throughout the entire trial, immediately rose and approached her owner. Bailey's tail wagged slowly, her body language showing nothing but trust and affection. She positioned herself about 3 feet in front of, waiting for instruction. "Now, Ms., David said gently, "show us the hand signal." Raised her hand slowly, her palm facing inward, fingers relaxed. It was the same gesture that had sparked this entire tragedy. This simple, non-violent hand signal that meant nothing to anyone but Bailey, and everything to their shared life. The courtroom held its breath. Bailey's response was immediate and unmistakable. The dog's tail wagged faster, her eyes brightened with recognition and joy. She trotted forward and with complete gentleness placed her front paws on his chest. Her entire body wiggled with excitement. She wasn't afraid. She wasn't cowering. She wasn't showing any sign of trauma or abuse. She was showing the kind of trust that only exists between a being who has been loved completely and unconditionally. His hand remained raised, maintaining the position had witnessed through the fence. Bailey's eyes tracked his hand with focus and anticipation, not fear. The dog gently licked his chin, her whole body vibrating with what could only be described as joy. Judge Harrison leaned forward, his stern expression softening as he witnessed the interaction. He'd seen hundreds of cases in his 30-year career, but this simple demonstration transcended all of them. This wasn't a courtroom performance. This was the unfiltered truth of a bond between two beings. Slowly brought her hand down, and Bailey dropped back to all 4 paws, pressing herself against legs. His other hand came down to gently pet the dog's head, and Bailey closed her eyes in contentment, clearly at peace in the presence of the person she loved most in the world. The entire gallery watched in stunned silence. A reporter in the front row had tears streaming down her face. Several animal rights activists, the same people who'd held signs calling a monster, were openly weeping. Even the prosecutor's assistant was looking at the floor, unable to maintain her expression of professional detachment. Judge Harrison himself seemed visibly moved. His jaw tightened, and he removed his glasses to wipe his eyes briefly before replacing them. "Thank you, Ms., David said quietly. "You may sit." But remained standing for a moment, her hand resting on Bailey's head, as if drawing strength from their connection. When she finally sat down, Bailey immediately lay down beside her, her head resting on his foot, a gesture of pure devotion. The courtroom remained silent for a long moment. No one seemed to know what to say. The evidence had been undeniable: veterinary records, behavioral expert testimony, video documentation. But this moment transcended evidence. This was truth made visible. Judge Harrison took a deep breath and began his remarks. his voice heavy with emotion that he was trying hard to control. "This case has taken many unexpected turns," he began. "What began as an animal cruelty prosecution has revealed itself to be something far different, something far darker. We have heard testimony from a veterinary expert confirming that Bailey shows zero signs of abuse. We have witnessed video evidence of a happy, healthy dog living with someone who clearly loves her. We have reviewed comprehensive veterinary records spanning 3 years, documenting Bailey's perfect health and excellent care." He paused, looking directly at. "And we have just witnessed a demonstration that speaks more eloquently than any expert testimony could. We have seen the bond between Ms. and Bailey. We have seen a dog respond to a hand signal not with fear, but with joy. We have seen trust made manifest." Harrison turned his attention to. "This court has also been presented with compelling evidence of motive. We have reviewed email correspondence demonstrating that the defendant in this case, Ms., had significant financial incentive to remove Ms. from the neighborhood. We have documented a pattern of escalating hostility toward Ms. related to a property dispute worth approximately $47,000. We have heard testimony suggesting that the animal cruelty complaint was not motivated by genuine concern for Bailey's welfare, but rather by a calculated strategy to drive Ms. away." His voice grew colder. "This is deeply troubling. The animal welfare system exists to protect innocent creatures from genuine abuse. That system has now been weaponized, used not to protect an animal, but to harm a human being for financial gain. This court finds that absolutely reprehensible." Harrison addressed the courtroom directly. "Animal cruelty laws exist for a reason. They protect beings who cannot protect themselves. But those laws can only serve their purpose if they're used honestly, if accusations are made in good faith, if the system isn't perverted by personal vendetta or financial motivation. What happened in this case is a perversion of justice." He looked back at. "On the charge of animal cruelty, this court finds the defendant not guilty on all counts. All charges are dismissed. Bailey remains in the custody and care of. Furthermore, this court strongly recommends that Ms. be prosecuted for perjury and filing false reports designed to harass and harm. This court also recommends civil penalties and damages to be awarded to Ms. for defamation, emotional distress, and legal fees." He banged his gavel once, the sound echoing through the silent courtroom like thunder. The moment seemed to freeze in time. Face crumpled, and she pulled Bailey into her arms, crying with a relief so profound it seemed to come from the very depths of her soul. Bailey, sensing her owner's emotion, licked her face repeatedly, her entire body pressed against, offering the only comfort she knew how to give. The courtroom erupted. Reporters jumped to their feet, shouting questions. Camera flashes exploded like lightning, but heard none of it. She was completely focused on Bailey, on the feel of her dog's warm fur against her skin, on the reality that they hadn't been separated, that they hadn't been destroyed by false accusation. David Martinez placed his hand on shoulder and squeezed gently. He didn't need to say anything. His presence was enough. As finally looked up, she saw something unexpected. The woman who'd been crying during her testimony was standing, clapping. Then another person stood. Then another. Within moments, a significant portion of the gallery was on their feet, applauding. Not mocking applause, but genuine appreciation for truth vindicated, for justice served, for an innocent woman and her beloved companion finally receiving the vindication they deserved. But the most powerful image, the one that would be replayed on every news station, captured in photographs that would go viral across the internet, remembered forever by everyone in that courtroom, was the simple gesture of his hand on Bailey's head as she looked into her dog's eyes and whispered words that only Bailey could hear. Words that probably said, "We made it. We're going home." Courthouse steps were absolute pandemonium as walked out into the afternoon sunlight, Bailey at her side, David Martinez beside her. The reporters surged forward with microphones and cameras, all shouting questions simultaneously, their voices blending into an incomprehensible roar. How does it feel to be vindicated? Will you be pursuing civil action against? What's next for you and Bailey? Stopped for a moment, her hand resting on Bailey's head. She looked directly into the cameras, and for the first time in weeks, she smiled. A genuine, luminous smile that seemed to shine from somewhere deep within her that had nearly been extinguished. Bailey and I are just grateful to have our lives back, she said, her voice steady and clear. We're grateful to the judge for seeing the truth, and we're grateful to David Martinez for fighting for us when it seemed like the entire world was against us. She didn't say anything about. She didn't express bitterness or anger. She simply took Bailey's leash and walked forward, David creating a protective barrier against the press. Behind them, supporters from the gallery had followed them outside, some still clapping, some simply standing in silent solidarity. As disappeared into David's car, the news helicopters circled overhead, capturing the image of a woman and her dog, finally free. 6 months later, the Nashville Gazette's headline read, "Wrongful prosecution settlement reached, awarded $287,000 in damages." The article detailed how had been convicted of perjury and filing false reports. She'd been sentenced to 2 years of probation, ordered to pay substantial damages to, and permanently barred from making complaints to animal welfare authorities. More importantly, the case had triggered investigations into similar false complaints in the Tennessee court system, revealing that this wasn't an isolated incident. This case had become a watershed moment in how the legal system approached animal welfare accusations. The American Kennel Club published a detailed case study about the trial in their professional journal, using it as an example of how emotional support animal training should be understood and protected. Universities began teaching the case in both animal law and criminal justice courses. The precedent Judge Harrison's verdict established became cited in subsequent cases across Tennessee and neighboring states. But the most significant impact came from herself. 3 months after the trial, she founded the Martinez Animal Advocacy Center, a nonprofit organization dedicated to protecting animal owners from false accusations, while simultaneously ensuring that genuine animal abuse cases received proper attention and resources. The organization provided free legal representation to individuals wrongly accused of animal cruelty, educated the public about the signs of genuine animal abuse versus normal dog behaviors, and worked with media outlets to prevent the kind of sensationalized reporting that had nearly destroyed her life. David Martinez donated his services as the nonprofit's legal director. Their first 15 cases, all individuals wrongly accused of animal cruelty, resulted in 14 acquittals and 1 settlement. The organization became a beacon of hope for people whose lives had been threatened by false accusations. Also became a vocal advocate for responsible social media activism. She gave interviews to major news outlets discussing how internet outrage culture had nearly destroyed her, how people had made judgments without evidence, how the speed of social media had overwhelmed the careful deliberation that justice required. "We have to slow down," she told one interviewer from NPR. "We have to ask ourselves, do I actually know this is true, or am I just reacting to a headline? Do I have the full context, or am I making assumptions? What if I'm wrong? What would it mean for this person if I'm wrong?" That empathy, that consideration of the possibility that we might be mistaken, is what's missing from social media activism. Her message resonated. Her TED Talk about false accusations and the of legal systems to settle personal disputes received over 2 million views. 1 year later, Bailey had become a minor celebrity. Her Instagram account, managed by, much to his initial embarrassment, had accumulated 340,000 followers. People from around the world sent Bailey messages expressing their support, thanking for fighting back, sharing their own stories of false accusations or family members who'd been wrongly convicted. Received letters weekly from people whose lives had been destroyed by similar false accusations. Some of them she helped through the Martinez Center. Others she simply corresponded with, providing emotional support and strategic advice. But her most rewarding work was local. She partnered with the Metro Nashville Animal Shelter, developing training programs to help other people learn to train their own emotional support animals safely and effectively. She worked with therapists to create standardized guidelines for ESA training that would be transparent and verifiable, making it harder for false accusations of abuse to gain traction. She also worked with Judge Harrison and the Tennessee judiciary to develop new protocols for handling animal cruelty cases. These protocols required that prosecutors present physical evidence of injury before moving forward with charges, that veterinary experts be consulted early in investigations, and that behavioral specialists be involved to distinguish between abuse and trained behaviors. Judge Harrison publicly credited with helping to reform the system that had nearly failed her. Ms. Courage in fighting back has made Tennessee a safer place for both animals and their owners, he said during a judicial conference. Her case exposed critical flaws in how we investigate and prosecute animal cruelty. Because she refused to accept injustice, the entire system has become more just. 2 years later, his property was sold at a significant loss. Unable to recover the boundary dispute, facing financial penalties from the case, and socially ostracized in Nashville, she relocated to Florida to start over. Her former neighbors, some of whom had supported her initially until the truth emerged, largely refused to speak with her. Her real estate career had effectively ended. No client wanted to work with someone known for weaponizing the legal system. She'd lost more than money. She'd lost her community, her reputation, and any prospect of a normal life in Nashville. Justice, in this case, had been served not just through the courts, but through the natural consequences of her actions. By contrast, had built a new life on the ashes of the old one. She'd returned to graphic design work, now specializing in nonprofits and advocacy organizations. Her client list included animal welfare groups, legal aid societies, and criminal justice reform organizations. She'd found her calling in using her skills to help people and animals who'd been wronged by systems that had failed them. Her relationship with her daughter Jessica had been repaired and strengthened. Jessica had become involved with the Martinez Center, helping develop their educational materials. Jessica's family, including now spent regular time with Aunt and Bailey, making up for the months of estrangement. 5 years later, stood on a stage at a criminal justice conference, looking out at an auditorium filled with prosecutors, judges, defense attorneys, and legal scholars. Behind her was a large image of Bailey. 5 years ago I was destroyed, began, her voice steady but carrying the weight of experience. Not physically, but spiritually, professionally, socially. I was painted as a monster by people who'd never met me, who had no evidence against me, who simply needed a villain for their moral narrative. My life nearly ended on that day when watched through a fence and saw something she didn't understand. She clicked to the next slide, a photo of Bailey and together smiling. But because I had the resources to hire an excellent attorney, because I had evidence that contradicted the accusation, because a judge was willing to look beyond the media narrative and examine facts, I survived. I not only survived, I thrived. But how many people don't have those advantages? How many innocent people are destroyed by false accusations because they can't afford lawyers? How many dogs are removed from loving homes based on misinterpretations and malice? She paused, letting the weight of the question settle over the audience. The legal system is supposed to protect the innocent. We're supposed to require evidence. We're supposed to presume innocence. But we've become a society that presumes guilt based on accusation, on social media outrage, on the persuasive power of a good narrative. My case is just one example of how catastrophically wrong that can go. Her speech that day became one of the most cited talks in criminal justice reform circles. Universities included it in their curriculum. Legal organizations distributed it to their members. More importantly, it inspired change. Over the following 5 years, animal welfare departments across the United States revised their protocols to include the kind of evidence-based investigations that might have prevented this ordeal. The Martinez Center expanded to 12 states, trained other attorneys to handle false accusation cases. The present day. And Bailey sit on the porch of their home, the same home where the rock had been thrown through the window 5 years ago. The window has been replaced. The house has been renovated. Everything that was broken has been repaired. Bailey, now 10 years old, rests her head on his lap, gray hairs becoming more prominent around her muzzle. Gently strokes her dog's head, feeling the familiar warmth, the steady presence that has anchored her through everything. "We made it, girl," whispers, just as she had on that day in the courtroom years ago. Bailey's tail wags softly, a gentle rhythm that speaks of contentment, of having survived, of having loved and been loved in return. The road from accusation to vindication had been long and harrowing, but had traveled it, not just for herself, but for everyone who would come after, everyone who would benefit from the reforms she'd inspired, everyone who would have their cases handled with greater care and evidence, everyone whose dogs would be protected by a legal system that had finally learned to distinguish between real abuse and misinterpreted kindness. Justice, had learned, wasn't just about winning a trial. It was about using that victory to transform systems, to protect others, to ensure that what happened to her could never happen to anyone else. Bailey looked up at her and smiled. They had survived. Together they had overcome. And together they would continue to fight for a more just world. The end.